You can sit with someone else's pain for hours without feeling tired. You listen, you understand, you stay steady, almost without thinking. But the moment you're alone with your own thoughts, something changes. The same patience disappears. The same understanding collapses. So why does compassion move outward so easily, yet break the second it turns towards you? There's a reason for that, and it has nothing to do with how much you're capable of feeling. There's something quiet that happens when you care about someone else. You become softer in ways you don't notice at first. You allow things to pass that you would normally analyze. You give explanations to their behavior before demanding answers. And somehow, it doesn't feel like effort. It feels appropriate, almost expected. But when that same dynamic turns inward, something changes. The softness disappears. The patience shortens. The explanations become accusations. And what felt natural before now feels unnatural, almost dishonest. But that's not the real reason it feels harder, because if it were simply about effort, you would eventually learn it. You've learned harder things before. You've adapted to worse conditions. So why does this one thing resist you? What most people don't realize is loving others and loving yourself are not built from the same internal system. When you love someone else, you are observing them from the outside. You see fragments, moments, behaviors. You don't experience their full internal noise, their contradictions, their hidden thoughts. You only see what reaches the surface. And because of that, your judgment is naturally incomplete. But with yourself, there is no distance. You don't see fragments. You see everything. Every contradiction, every hesitation, every thought you wish you didn't have. You don't get to experience yourself as a finished version. You experience yourself in real time, unfinished, inconsistent, and often unclear. And that's where something subtle begins to shift. Because when you love others, you are loving a curated version of them, without even realizing it. Not fake, just incomplete. But when you look at yourself, there is no curation. There is no distance. There is no filter softening the edges. And that's where it starts to feel unfair. You hold yourself to a standard of total awareness while holding others to a standard of visible behavior. And those are not equal standards. But even that isn't the deepest layer. Because you might think, okay, then I just need to be more forgiving with myself. But when you try that, something resists. It feels unnatural, like you're pretending, like you're letting yourself get away with something. And that resistance isn't random, it was built. What most people don't realize is self-perception is not something you create freely. It's something you inherit, absorb, and slowly reinforce over time. There was a point, probably earlier than you remember, where how you saw yourself was shaped by how you were responded to, not just what people said, but how they reacted, the tone, the silence, the subtle shifts in attention. You learned, without being told directly, what parts of you were acceptable and what parts needed to be corrected. But here's where it becomes complicated. When you learned to love others, you weren't carrying that same weight. You weren't trying to manage their image in the same way you were taught to manage your own. You could approach them with curiosity instead of control. But with yourself, control never really leaves. You're not just observing who you are. You're monitoring it, adjusting it, evaluating it in real time. And that constant evaluation creates something that feels like distance, but isn't. It's pressure. And pressure doesn't allow softness to exist naturally. But that still doesn't explain everything. Because even people who understand this still feel the same difficulty. And that's where the next layer reveals itself. Loving others often comes with a kind of emotional asymmetry. You don't expect perfection from them in the same way you expect it from yourself. You allow their mistakes to exist without redefining their entire identity. But with yourself, one mistake doesn't stay isolated. It expands. It becomes a pattern, a confirmation, a reflection of something deeper that you assume has always been there. And what most people don't realize is, this expansion isn't truth. It's habit. A habit of interpreting yourself as a fixed identity rather than a changing process. But even knowing that doesn't make it stop. Because the real issue isn't just how you see yourself, it's how close you are to yourself. And that closeness removes the illusion that makes love feel easy. When you love someone else, there's space. And in that space, you can choose what to focus on. You can emphasize what feels meaningful. You can ignore what feels temporary. But with yourself, there is no space. You are always present with your own thoughts, even the ones you don't agree with. You hear everything. You notice everything. And over time, that constant exposure changes how you relate to yourself. Not because you're flawed, but because you're too familiar. And familiarity doesn't always create comfort. Sometimes it removes it. But even that isn't the final piece. Because if it were only about familiarity, then time would fix it. But for many people, it doesn't. It stays the same, or even becomes harder. And that's where something deeper starts to surface. Something that has less to do with love and more to do with permission. Because loving others doesn't require you to question your own worth. But loving yourself does. And for many people, that's where the real resistance begins. Not in the action, but in the implication. Because if you accept yourself fully, without condition, what does that say about everything you've been correcting, criticizing, and holding against yourself for years? And that question is not as simple as it seems. Because it doesn't just challenge how you feel, it challenges how you've been defining yourself this entire time. And once that starts to shift, something else begins to move underneath it. Something quieter, but much harder to face. Because what you're actually struggling with isn't love. It's the structure that decides whether you're allowed to feel it at all. And that structure doesn't come from where you think it does, which is exactly where the deeper conflict begins to reveal itself. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. There's something else happening underneath all of this. Something quieter, but much more decisive. When you sit with someone else's pain, you are not trying to rewrite it. You're not interrupting their experience every few seconds to question whether it should exist. You allow it to unfold, even if you don't fully understand it. But when it comes to your own pain, you rarely give it that same permission. It's not just that you feel it. It's that you immediately begin negotiating with it. You question whether it's justified, whether it makes sense, whether it says something about you that you don't want to admit. And that constant negotiation changes the experience. Because compassion requires a kind of stillness, an ability to let something exist long enough to be understood. But if every thought, every emotion is being interrupted, evaluated, and reshaped in real time, there's no stillness left. And without stillness, compassion has nowhere to settle. But that's not the only shift. What most people don't realize is, when you care about someone else, you are not using their emotions as evidence against them. You don't take one moment of weakness and stretch it across their entire identity. You don't assume that a single reaction defines who they are. You allow their experience to remain temporary. But with yourself, that boundary collapses. One thought doesn't stay a thought. It becomes a reflection. One reaction doesn't stay a reaction. It becomes a pattern. And over time, those patterns start to feel permanent, even when they're not. And that's where something subtle begins to distort. Because you're no longer responding to what's happening in the moment. You're responding to what you believe it represents. And what it represents is often much heavier. But even that isn't the most difficult part. Because beneath all of this, there's a quieter assumption that rarely gets questioned. When you sit with someone else, you assume they are allowed to be incomplete. You don't expect them to arrive as a finished version of themselves. You accept that they are in the middle of something, even if that something is unclear. But with yourself, that assumption disappears. You don't treat your current state as part of a process. You treat it as a result. Something that should already make sense, already be resolved, already be aligned, and when it isn't, the gap becomes uncomfortable. Not because the gap is unusual, but because you interpret it as failure instead of movement. But that interpretation didn't appear randomly. It formed over time, reinforced by a quiet expectation that you should be more consistent, more controlled, more certain than you actually are. And the closer you get to yourself, the harder it becomes to maintain that illusion. Because you can't hide your contradictions from yourself. You can't simplify your own experience into something clean and easy to understand. You see the parts that don't match, the thoughts that interrupt each other, the emotions that shift without warning. And over time, that exposure changes how you relate to yourself. Not because you're lacking something, but because you're seeing too much without distance. But here's where it turns in a way most people don't expect. The difficulty isn't just that you see too much, it's that you don't get to forget. When you interact with others, your memory of them is selective. Certain moments stand out, others fade. You don't carry every detail of who they've been. You hold on to what feels relevant, what feels meaningful. But with yourself, nothing fully fades. Even if you don't think about something for a while, it stays accessible. The memory of how you felt, what you thought, what you did, it remains part of your internal reference. And that continuity creates weight. Because now, you're not just responding to the present moment, you're responding to a layered history that feels connected, even when it shouldn't be. And that makes compassion harder. Not because you don't deserve it, but because you're working with a version of yourself that feels too complete, too defined, too fixed. But that perception is misleading. Because what feels complete is actually just accumulated, and what feels fixed is often just repeated interpretation. But even when you understand that, something still resists. Because there's one final layer underneath all of this, one that doesn't come from your thoughts or your emotions, but from something more foundational: control. When you relate to others, you don't expect to control who they are. You might influence them, support them, guide them, but you don't feel fully responsible for their internal state. There's a natural boundary, but with yourself, that boundary disappears. You feel responsible for everything: your thoughts, your reactions, your patterns, your progress. And that sense of responsibility turns your inner world into something that always needs to be adjusted, improved, corrected. And that constant correction leaves very little room for acceptance, because acceptance feels like stopping, and stopping feels like losing control. But that fear of losing control isn't as simple as it seems, because it doesn't come from wanting perfection. It comes from something deeper, something that has been quietly shaping the way you relate to yourself for a long time, something that makes letting go feel unsafe, even when holding on is exhausting. And that's where the real conflict begins to reveal itself. Not in the way you treat yourself, but in the reason you feel the need to treat yourself that way at all. Because what looks like difficulty loving yourself is actually a conflict between two opposing forces inside you. One that wants to understand and one that feels the need to control. And as long as those two remain unresolved, compassion will always feel unstable. Not because it's impossible, but because something deeper keeps interrupting it before it has the chance to fully exist. And once you start to see that clearly, the struggle begins to look different. Not simpler, but more precise. And that's where the real problem starts to take shape. What makes this difficult isn't just how you think about yourself, it's what you believe your thoughts are doing. Because most people assume their inner voice is there to guide them, to correct, to improve, to keep things on track. It feels necessary, almost responsible. Like if you loosen it, even slightly, something will fall apart. But that assumption hides something deeper. Because that voice doesn't just guide, it monitors. And monitoring is not the same as understanding. When you sit with someone else, you're not tracking every inconsistency in what they say. You're not measuring their reactions against an internal standard in real time. You're allowing them to exist without constant evaluation. But with yourself, evaluation never really stops. It's immediate, automatic, continuous. And over time, that constant evaluation creates a subtle shift in how you experience your own mind. You stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a system that needs to be managed. But that's not the real problem, because management in itself isn't harmful. You manage your time, your decisions, your priorities. It's a normal part of functioning. So why does it become so heavy when it turns inward? What most people don't realize is, when management becomes internal, it doesn't stay limited to behavior. It expands into identity. You're no longer just adjusting what you do, you're adjusting what you are. And that's where something begins to tighten. Because now, every thought isn't just a passing moment. It becomes something to interpret, something to analyze, something to either accept or reject based on what it might mean about you. And that creates a kind of internal pressure that doesn't exist when you're relating to others. But even that isn't the deepest issue, because underneath that pressure, there's a belief that rarely gets questioned. The belief that if you stop monitoring yourself, you'll lose control of who you are. Not gradually, but completely. And that belief changes everything, because now compassion doesn't feel safe. It feels like a risk. When you soften toward yourself, even slightly, it can feel like you're lowering your standards, like you're allowing things to slide that shouldn't be allowed, like you're opening the door to becoming someone you don't want to be. And that fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet resistance, a subtle discomfort when you try to be kinder to yourself. A feeling that something isn't right, even if you can't explain why. But that resistance isn't random. It's protective, not in a healthy way, but in a familiar one. Because at some point, control became linked to safety. Not physical safety, but psychological stability. A sense that if you stayed aware, stayed critical, stayed in control, you could prevent things from going too far in the wrong direction. And over time, that connection becomes automatic. You don't question it anymore. You just feel it. So when compassion starts to appear, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like exposure. But that's where it starts to hurt in a way that's hard to explain. Because part of you does want that softness. That same patience you give to others, that ability to sit with yourself without immediately trying to fix or reshape what you find. But another part of you doesn't trust it. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, in the context of your own identity, feels unstable. But even that isn't the full picture, because the conflict isn't just between control and compassion. It's between two different ways of relating to yourself that have been developing at the same time. One that observes, and one that evaluates. The observing part of you can notice what you're feeling without immediately reacting to it. It can hold space, just like you do for others. It doesn't rush to conclusions. But the evaluating part doesn't wait. It assigns meaning instantly. It categorizes, labels, compares. It tries to maintain consistency, to make sure everything aligns with the version of you that feels acceptable. And when these two parts operate together, something gets disrupted, because observation requires space, and evaluation removes it. So instead of understanding yourself, you end up interrupting yourself, again and again. And over time, that interruption becomes your default way of being, not intentional, just practiced. But here's where it becomes even more complicated, because the evaluating part doesn't see itself as the problem. It sees itself as the solution. It believes it's helping you stay in control, stay aware, stay better than you would be without it. And because of that, it resists anything that threatens its role, including compassion. Because compassion doesn't evaluate, it allows. And allowing to the part of you that is built around control feels like a loss. But what most people don't realize is, this isn't just about how you treat yourself. It's about what you believe would happen if you stopped treating yourself that way. Because if you stop correcting yourself, who are you without that correction? If you stop monitoring every thought, what thoughts might stay? If you stop holding yourself to constant awareness, what parts of you might surface that you've been keeping in check? And those questions don't have easy answers, because they don't just challenge behavior, they challenge identity. And when identity feels uncertain, control becomes stronger, not weaker, which is why this conflict doesn't resolve on its own. It repeats, quietly, consistently, and the longer it repeats, the more it starts to feel like who you are instead of something you're doing. But that's where the second layer of the problem begins to unfold. Because what you're protecting might not be what you think, and what you're afraid of losing might not actually need to be held onto at all. What you're protecting isn't just control. It's a version of yourself that was built under pressure. Not obvious pressure, not something dramatic or easy to point at, but a quieter kind, the kind that teaches you over time that who you are is something that needs to be managed carefully, not expressed, managed. And once that pattern forms, it doesn't disappear when the pressure is gone. It becomes internal, self-sustaining. So now, even in moments where nothing is demanding anything from you, you still feel the need to monitor, to adjust, to stay within certain lines that no one is actively drawing anymore. But that's not the real reason it stays. Because habits can change, patterns can fade. So why does this one feel so persistent? What most people don't realize is, it's not just a habit, it's an agreement, an internal agreement that says, if I stay aware enough, if I stay critical enough, I can prevent something about myself from becoming unacceptable. And that agreement doesn't need to be spoken out loud to be powerful. It just needs to feel true. But here's where it becomes difficult in a way that most people don't expect, because you're not entirely sure what you're protecting yourself from. It's not always clear. There's no single thought you can point to and say, this is the thing I'm afraid of becoming. It's more vague than that. A sense of being wrong. A sense of being too much or not enough. A sense that if you loosen your grip, something about you might surface that you won't be able to control. And because it's vague, it becomes harder to challenge. You can't reason with something that isn't fully defined, so instead you manage everything, just in case. But that constant management comes with a cost, because when you're always trying to prevent something, you're never fully allowing anything. Not your thoughts, not your emotions, not even your own presence. Everything becomes conditional. And that's where compassion starts to feel impossible, because compassion doesn't operate under conditions. It doesn't wait for you to become clearer, more consistent, more aligned. It meets you where you are, even when that place is uncertain, unfinished, or contradictory. But your internal system isn't built for that. It's built to reduce uncertainty, not sit with it. And that difference creates tension. Because now, when you try to be kinder to yourself, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like you're stepping outside of something that has been holding you together. But what most people don't realize is that structure isn't holding you together. It's holding you in place. There's a difference. But that difference is hard to see when you've been inside it for so long, because stability can feel like safety, even when it's limiting you, and control can feel like clarity, even when it's distorting how you see yourself. But here's where the conflict deepens, because part of you has already started to notice this. That quiet moment when you realize you're being harder on yourself than necessary. That brief pause where you see the pattern instead of just reacting from inside it. That awareness changes something. Not enough to stop the pattern, but enough to make it visible. And once something becomes visible, it can't fully return to being automatic. And that creates a new kind of tension, because now you're not just inside the pattern, you're aware of it, but still participating in it. And that's where it starts to feel frustrating, because you can see what's happening, but you can't seem to step out of it. And that's not because you're doing something wrong, it's because the pattern isn't just behavioral, it's structural. It's built into how you interpret yourself in real time, which means you don't just need to change what you do, you need to shift how you relate to what's happening as it's happening. And that's not something that happens through force, because force is part of the problem. The more you try to fix yourself, the more you reinforce the idea that there's something that needs to be fixed. And that keeps the cycle going. But here's the part that's rarely acknowledged. You're not just afraid of losing control, you're also unsure who you are without it. Because control has been shaping your sense of identity for so long that letting go of it, even slightly, creates a kind of emptiness. Not in a dramatic way, just a subtle absence of something that used to define how you moved through your own thoughts. And that absence can feel disorienting, because now there's space, and space without familiarity doesn't always feel peaceful. Sometimes it just feels unknown. But that unknown isn't the problem, it's the entry point. Because what you've been calling difficulty loving yourself isn't really about love. The shift doesn't start with trying to love yourself. That's where most people go wrong, and why it keeps feeling forced, because loving yourself sounds like something you should be able to do directly. Like a decision, like a mindset you can apply if you just think differently for long enough. But that approach quietly keeps the same structure in place. You're still trying to change yourself, just in a softer way, and that's why it doesn't hold. Because the issue was never the absence of love. It was the constant interference. So the shift doesn't begin with adding something new. It begins with removing something that's been there the entire time, without you realizing how often it appears. Interruption. Not your thoughts, not your emotions. The way you interrupt them. That subtle moment where something arises, and before it fully forms, you've already started to question it, adjust it, reshape it. That moment is so fast, so automatic, that it doesn't even feel like a choice anymore. But it is. Not in the sense that you can stop it instantly, but in the sense that you can begin to notice it. And that's where the shift actually starts. Not with changing what you feel, but with seeing how quickly you move against it. Because what most people don't realize is, compassion isn't something you create. It's something that appears when interference lowers. The same way silence isn't something you build, it's what's left when noise fades. But that doesn't mean you have to silence your mind. It means you stop stepping in front of it every time something appears. And that sounds simple, but it changes the entire experience. Because instead of reacting immediately, you begin to allow something to complete itself. A thought finishes. An emotion moves without being redirected. A reaction exists without being labeled or corrected in real time. And at first, that might feel unfamiliar, not peaceful, just unfamiliar. Because you're used to being involved in everything that happens internally. Stepping back, even slightly, can feel like losing your role. But you're not losing anything. You're changing positions from inside the reaction to beside it. And that small shift creates something that wasn't there before. Space. Not distance in a cold sense, but space in a way that allows things to be seen without immediate pressure. And in that space, something subtle begins to change. Not dramatically, just enough. Because when something is no longer being interrupted, it becomes easier to understand. Not because it's clearer, but because it's allowed to unfold. And understanding over time begins to soften the need for control, not by force, but by making control feel less necessary. But here's where people get stuck. They try to maintain that space. They try to stay aware, stay present, stay detached. And without realizing it, they turn awareness into another form of control, another standard, another thing to get right. And that brings the same pressure back, just in a different form. So the shift isn't about maintaining anything. It's about noticing when you've stepped back in. Because you will. Naturally, repeatedly. The pattern doesn't disappear just because you've seen it once, but each time you notice it, something loosens. Not the pattern itself, but your attachment to it. And over time, that changes how strongly it operates. Not because you're fighting it, but because you're no longer fully identified with it. But that still leaves one question unresolved. If you're not trying to love yourself, then what are you actually doing? And the answer is less satisfying than people expect. You're allowing yourself to be experienced without constant correction. Not fully, not perfectly, just more than before. And that difference, small as it seems, changes the direction of everything that follows. Because once you stop interrupting your own experience, something else begins to appear. Not immediately, not consistently, but enough to notice. And that's where something new starts to take shape, without being forced into existence. At first, it doesn't feel like love. That's the part most people misunderstand, because what begins to appear isn't warmth or comfort or anything you would immediately recognize as kindness. It's something much quieter than that. It's the absence of resistance. Moments where you notice a thought and don't move against it right away. Moments where an emotion rises and instead of correcting it, you let it stay a little longer than you normally would. And those moments are easy to overlook because they don't feel significant. But that's where the shift is happening, not in what you add, but in what you stop doing. Because over time, those small gaps, those brief spaces without interruption, start to accumulate, and something begins to change. You start to see your thoughts not as instructions, but as events. Your emotions not as problems, but as movements. And that difference quietly alters how you relate to yourself. Not all at once, just enough. But here's where it becomes something deeper. Because as that space grows, even slightly, you begin to notice something unexpected. Not everything inside you needs to be controlled. Some things settle on their own, if they're not constantly being pushed, reshaped, or resisted. And that realization changes the role you've been playing. You're no longer managing every part of yourself in real time. You're allowing parts of yourself to move without supervision. And that can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because control has been your way of staying stable for so long that stepping out of it feels like stepping into something uncertain. But what most people don't realize is stability doesn't disappear when control softens. It just changes form. It becomes less rigid, less forced, more responsive. Not because you're doing something better, but because you're interfering less. And in that reduced interference, something else becomes possible. You begin to relate to yourself the same way you've always related to others. Not by trying to fix everything, but by allowing things to be seen before they're changed. And that's where compassion starts to return, not as an effort, not as a practice, but as a byproduct of space. Because when something is fully seen without being interrupted, it becomes easier to understand. And when something is understood, even partially, it becomes harder to treat it with the same level of harshness. Not because you're forcing kindness, but because harshness no longer feels as necessary. But even then, it won't be consistent. There will still be moments where the pattern returns, where you slip back into monitoring, correcting, evaluating everything as it happens. That doesn't mean the shift is gone. It means the pattern is still familiar, and familiarity takes time to loosen. So the goal isn't to eliminate it, it's to recognize it, without turning that recognition into another form of pressure. Because the moment you start judging yourself for not doing it right, you're back inside the same structure, just with a different label. So instead, the shift stays simple. You notice, you pause, and you don't immediately interfere. Not every time, just enough times that something different has space to exist. And over time, that something different becomes more natural, not because you practiced it perfectly, but because you stopped preventing it from happening. And that's the part that changes everything, because what you've been calling loving yourself was never something you needed to build from nothing. It was something that couldn't fully appear under constant interruption. So, when that interruption softens, even slightly, what remains begins to feel different, less forced, less distant, less like something you have to achieve, and more like something that was already there, just waiting for space. Not perfect, not complete, but real enough to recognize. And maybe that's where it begins to shift for you, not in a big moment, not in a clear transformation, but in something quieter. The next time you notice yourself reacting, the next time a thought appears that you would normally correct, you don't rush to change it, you let it exist, just a little longer. And that small difference might not feel like much at first, but it's enough. Enough to begin. Enough to see something you haven't been able to see before. And if you stay with that, even briefly, you might start to notice something changing in the background. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, in a way that doesn't demand anything from you, just attention. And from there, there's more to uncover, more to understand, more that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. So if something in this felt familiar or slightly uncomfortable in a way you couldn't explain, stay with that. There's more beneath it, and you're closer to it than you think.